It's kind of very interesting that despite of the way in which the world has changed, a very complex kind of world that I think we see now, whereas we didn't perhaps see maybe 20 or 30 years ago, there still is this kind of attachment to the notion of the leader rather than, as you say, the kind of process of leadership. But if I can just pick you up on 2 points. One was around a kind of affirmative approach to examining what's going on, which is to say that you are looking, perhaps as a leader, into what works and why it works and that kind of thing. And then separate from that, but related to that, the notion of engagement and perhaps large-scale engagement, I don't know. Do you have thoughts about the connection of those two things as well?
Well, I mean, the affirmative approach, of which there is a long literature, is an alternative way of assuming that the way that we approach the problem, if it is actually the problem. We approach it as if the problem is the thing that's causing the difficulty, and therefore what we need to address is the weakness, which goes back to the limits of our leaders. They need to be improved, as opposed to an affirmative approach, which is let's find out what's good, what works, and work on that basis. So instantly, it's not a question of blaming people for problems. It's actually a question of saying, actually, we're pretty good. We can do these things really well. Let's think about why these things work well, and let's take those up on board and work with those to solve whatever these issues are that's coming up. So if you lock into this kind of deficit model, first of all, it's demobilizing. Secondly, you don't need to think about, is the entire organization somehow involved in this? Well, no, it isn't, because all the problems lie at the top level. It's a deficit model, so we just need to get rid of those. And what we do is, when you fail as the new chief exec, as you will do in 2 years from now, we'll get rid of you and we'll get somebody else. And that'll be great for at least 6 weeks, and then they will start to fail and we get somebody else. And nobody will sit back and say, what's going on here is that these people can't do it. It isn't that there's something wrong with them. It's that the organisation and the system that we're using is actually in itself the problem.
Sure.
So what we need to do is think about, what can we do right, and stop trying to attribute responsibility and blame onto individuals. And this kind of deficit approach is really deleterious to organisational health. And it explains why it's so difficult to recruit head teachers, for example. Why would you want a horrendous job with all that responsibility, all those hours, for limited reward, when all the fault is yours when it goes wrong? Nothing to do with the families of the kids or the other teachers or anybody else. It's just you.
Yeah. But is there a place then for a kind of coordinated response on this conceptualisation of leadership? If we characterise what you're saying as a more modern kind of way of seeing leadership, and what we have been used to for a long time as being kind of traditional mode of leadership, is there a way to combat that? And the reason why I asked the question is, if you're a kind of senior person, say in the Department for Education and Skills, and you have a minister to work for, and your minister is being pilloried by the press, then there is clearly an operating deficit model there. They're being attacked, and whilst it may be kind of right for us to think about it being an inappropriate way to be, that's the way it is. Did you have any thoughts about tackling that?
Well, I mean, one thing is the role of the press in the construction of our models of leadership, and it's exactly the same with our constructions of celebrity. Yeah. For some reason, we appear to be besotted by celebrity status, and the press do exactly the same thing with celebrities as they do with leaders. Yeah. They put them on a pedestal and then they chop them down again when they feel like it. So I think that same notion of the kind of white elephant prevails here. So going back to the first part about how do we need to operate like this? What we know about change programs is that simply changing the individual doesn't make much difference, because you still get the same problem. So it's really about processes and cultural change, and that implies that if you as an individual are trying to take a different kind of line, and when things go wrong, say, hey, stop blaming me. This is a system-wide problem. You aren't going to last very long unless you can get a system process involved, which means that everybody takes up responsibility. So I don't think this is an issue of the leader. It's an issue of leadership and how we constitute leadership culture. So it's very difficult, for example, for civil servants to be thinking in a different context when they're driven by short-term measures and the requirements of their political controllers. And this is not something which is just to do with the British civil service. I've been doing some work with the New Zealand civil service, and it's exactly the same. It's about the people at the top of the civil service really are not, in that sense, leading their organisations, leading people who are below them. They're actually managing the person who's above them. And their sole focus is on, can I deliver what is required of me in 24 hours? Otherwise, we're both going to be pilloried. And I think it's trying to educate systems and cultures to think differently about who is responsible for this, and why do these things constantly happen, and why do we always seem to be in a crisis? why are we changing the NHS every year? If we've been changing it for 20 years every year, why doesn't it seem to be working perfectly? Is that because we're approaching it as either an individualistic problem, chief exec's no good, get the next chief exec in, that doesn't seem to work either, so that isn't working, or are we approaching it as a tame problem? That we just have to keep refining this and eventually we'll get it right, when it doesn't seem to be a tame problem in the sense that there's a clear scientific answer to this issue. What we need to think about is, let's just sit back for a minute and think about, what are we trying to do with the NHS? I mean, the typical wicked problem would be what we're going to do with people over a certain age as increasingly the balance of the old increases in proportion to the young. We have a major funding problem in the NHS. We have to make a decision about what we're going to do. But rather than taking a political decision about saying to people, okay, look, there's only a finite amount of resources. So either we have more care for the elderly, or we have less kidney allowances, or whatever it is that we do. We have to make a decision, and you have to be involved in the decision. What we do is we kind of ignore the elephant in the room and talk about, well, if we just change the targets, and then tweak the targets, that'll be all right, won't it? And it won't be all right.
It's interesting, a lot of what you say is kind of related in part to issues of engagement and inclusivity. And it sometimes can be very difficult for senior people in organisations to bring that about. And I suppose that if you looked at the diary of any senior person or minister across government, you'd find there's almost no space at all, because they're kind of locked in meetings, probably in bilaterals or 2 or 3 people meetings. So is there something also in what you're saying about the way in which leaders view their organisations, the way in which they think about how they spend their time with their people, or that kind of thing?
There's a nice example of the Jesuits. Ignatius Loyola's house is still used as a museum of the Jesuit Society, and a colleague of mine was being shown around the house, and one of the guests, one of the American guests, said, so do you still use this house? And then whoever the Jesuit priest was said, yes, we hold this for all the important meetings. And said, so, gee, it's not a very big house. How often do you hold the meetings? Is it 2 or 3 times a month or what? And he said, no, we've had 34 in the history of the Jesuits. So, how can you only hold 34? And he said, well, we only hold meetings when we need to. When there's a change of policy, we hold a meeting, otherwise we don't. What would you want to have a meeting for if you're not changing policy? And I think it's just rethinking things. And on the one hand, there are occasions where you need lots of collaboration, but you don't always need lots of collaboration. If there's 15 of us involved in this decision, that makes me not responsible. If it's just me taking the risk, then I am responsible. And we have to get this balance right between, this is a wicked problem, that requires collaborative effort, lots of meetings. This is not a wicked problem, it's a tame problem. I don't need lots of meetings, we'll just do it because I know it works. And if it screws up, that's my fault. Now, if it screws up and it's my fault and I'm held responsible, there's a strange phenomenon that goes on here, which implies as soon as you make a mistake, you become the person whose head has to be severed, as if we are actually perfect people who never make mistakes. But none of us are perfect, we're all going to make mistakes. So why do we pillory people who make mistakes? Unless we have this image of the white elephant leader, the great God, who doesn't make mistakes. And I think we need to get beyond that and think, these are generally made mistakes, that's fine, that's what we do. We give this person the responsibility, they take the risk. If it goes wrong, they're held responsible. But that doesn't mean you have to lose your job. It means we have to learn and go on. There's a Danish poet, Piet Hein, who basically wrote a poem called The Road to Wisdom. And it's something like, the road to wisdom is to err and err and err again, but less and less and less. And it's just thinking about, and unless we give people opportunities to fail, they're never going to learn to lead properly, because leadership is about the wisdom which you get from experience, and the experience is about having to cope with failure. So rather than assume anybody's made a mistake needs to be shot, anybody who made a mistake probably has learned a lot from it. And that's what we need to think about. And that means take responsibility, take the risk, and if things go wrong, well, that's just the price we pay for giving people responsibility.
Sure. Well, I think that's a really nice note to end on. So I'd like to thank you very much for the time you've taken. It's been a great pleasure, and thank you.
Okay.